Today we're going to add persistent user login authentication to our React app. And we're going to do this securely without using local storage or session storage. Now I just logged in Jane. She's an admin user and she'll go to the admin page. In the past, if we reloaded our app, she would have to log back in. But now our app remembers what page Jane was on and remembers that she was logged in. Likewise, Jane can visit a site like Google, and then she can come back to the site and it continues to remember that she is logged in. This is because we added a persistent user login. Let's look at how this works in React. Hello and welcome. Hi, I'm Dave. Today we're going to add persistent user login authentication to our React app. This is more of an intermediate level React tutorial than it is beginner. And while this tutorial provides information on its own, it is part of a series where we've built a registration page, a login page, and added protected routes, as well as applying JWT access and refresh tokens for authentication. And if you've completed my Node.js for Beginners course, you've already built the backend that we're using in these tutorials. I'll share links in the description to all of these and the source code for this tutorial too. Okay, I have our React app running in Chrome. This is from the starter code, and a link to the starter code is in the description below. I also have the Node.js REST API running in another instance of Visual Studio Code, and that is the backend. So if you're trying to run this code along with me, both of those need to be running. Now I'm going to log Jane in, and I've got the DevTools open already, and we'll just quickly see in the console that Jane receives user roles and an access token from the backend server. Now I'm not going to explain JWTs in detail like I did in the previous tutorial. If you're not familiar with the JWT strategy, I really recommend watching that previous tutorial I had on that, where we applied the JWT strategy to this app. But what we're getting is this access token, and we're storing it in the state of the application. You do not want to store access tokens in local storage or anywhere else that JavaScript can reach them, because if you can put it there with JavaScript, a hacker can also retrieve it with JavaScript. Now, what you don't see here is that we also get a refresh token, but the backend server issues that in a secure HTTP only cookie. And that's where the refresh token is at. And then after a specific set amount of time, what happens is our access token expires. And that's what we see right here with the 403. And what we then have is sending the refresh token to the server to say, hey, give us a new access token. And that was all implemented in the last tutorial. So you see all of that here, and now we can see our users list. The problem we have, and some noted in the comments of the last tutorial, is that if we refresh the app or visit another page and come back, we lose that state. We lose the access token because it's only stored in memory. We don't want to put it in local storage or anywhere else that someone else could grab it. So the problem being, you refresh the app, you visit another page and come back, and either one, what happens is you lose the state and we're logged out. We have to log back in on every refresh or anytime we come back to the app. A persistent user login will eliminate that issue. However, it's not as secure. So if you're really trying to make a secure app, I suggest you live with having to log back in, and maybe especially, I guess, something financial or otherwise, maybe that would be the way to go. But today we're going to add a persistent user login, and we'll put a trust this device or remember me check mark down here as well. So right now I'm going to close DevTools and resize Chrome, and we'll start in Visual Studio Code. Okay, let's go to the components directory, just highlight that and create a new file. We want a new component, and let's just call this component PersistLogin.js. Now I'm going to go ahead and expand Visual Studio Code, and I think I'm even going to press Control B to hide the file tree for now, just so we see all the code here. The first thing I'm going to do is import outlet, and that's going to come from React-router-DOM, and we're using React Router 6 in this application. After that, I'm going to import useState, and I also want useEffect. And then after that, let's go ahead and import our useRefreshToken hook that we created. That is a custom hook that we created in the last tutorial. And that's going to be in the hooks directory. And after that, we pick the useRefreshToken hook. There we go. And we're also going to need our custom useAuth hook. And that's going to come from, once again, the hooks folder, and then we're going to choose useAuth. There we go. Okay, now we have everything we need imported. Let's start our function. It's going to be PersistLogin. And then inside of here, we'll start with some state. So we'll have isLoading, and then set isLoading. We'll set this equal to useState, and we're going to start with a state of true. It's going to be a Boolean, true or false. After that, let's get our refresh function from our useRefreshToken hook. Okay, and then we need to go ahead and grab the current auth from our useAuth hook. Let's add a useEffect now. And this useEffect is only going to run when the component loads, so we want an empty dependency array. And now inside useEffect, I'll scroll this up so it takes up the rest of the screen. Inside the useEffect, we're going to define a function. I'm going to call this verifyRefreshToken. And it's an async function. And inside this function, we're going to have a try block. And in the try block, we're just going to await the refresh function. That's going to reach out to the endpoint and take the cookie with it, and that's the function we created in our useRefreshToken hook. When it sends that cookie to the refresh endpoint, then it sends us back a new access token, and that's what we need. And we want to do that before we get to the RequireAuth component that would kick us back out, and that's why we've got this component here. So here is our catch now, and we'll just console, let's put console error and pass that in, and then a finally. And this finally block is a great place to set the isLoading to false. I spell false, there we go. Because no matter whether we have an error or not, this finally block is always going to run. So that will prevent us from getting in this endless loading loop. Now remember, we just defined the function here, so we're still going to need to call that. We've also brought in the auth state, and that's important. Now, when we come back, say when we would reload the page or come back from another page back to our app, we will have an empty auth state. And so we need to make sure that we only run this when we do not have that access token. We don't want to hit the refresh endpoint just every time we request a protected page. We only want to do it when we lack an access token. So here we'll check the auth, and I'm going to use optional chaining and check the access token. So if we do not have an access token, then we're going to call this function verifyRefreshToken. Otherwise, we're going to just set isLoading to false. And we need to do that because we won't be running this function at all that would set isLoading to false here. So it needs to happen here if we do not run the verifyRefreshToken. And with that, we have completed the logic that we need for our useEffect, but we're not finished with the component itself yet. I'm going to add another useEffect that we can remove later. This is just for us to see what's going on. So in this useEffect, once again, it will only run, well, it's not going to run just at load time. It's going to run anytime the isLoading state changes, and that will let us see what's happening. So now I want to have a console log, and in here I'm going to put a template literal and say isLoading, so we know what we're looking at, and pass in the isLoading state. After that, I'll just copy this down, and we want to look at a value for our auth token as well. So I'll just call this AT, but we can't just pass in the auth token here. We're going to need json.stringify, there it is. And here I'll pass in auth, again with optional chaining, and then access token. So we can see that in the console as well and save. Now we need to put the JSX in our component. I'll scroll up again, and of course that starts with a return. And now I'll have a parentheses, and we're going to use an HTML fragment. And inside the fragment is where we can put some logic here. So we'll check our isLoading state. And now let's create a ternary here, and I'll put it on separate lines. So the true response would be to say, okay, we're loading. And if you had a component that had a spinner or something, this would be a great place to put it. I'm not going to do that today, but just a suggestion. And otherwise, we'll pass that outlet that we imported from React Router. Remember, the outlet is going to represent all of the child components, or child routes even, inside of our PersistLogin route. And we're going to wrap this around all of our restricted or protected routes. So let's save this. And then before I forget, we just need our export statement at the bottom. So export default PersistLogin, and we should be finished now with our component. So this really handles the logic to say if we need to go check that refresh token, and that will help our persistent login only check that refresh token endpoint when it needs to. Okay, let's go back to the file tree. And now I need to go ahead and collapse the components directory, but let's look in the hooks directory and find that useRefreshToken hook. And let's quickly look at that. I'll hide the file tree again with Control B. But what we're getting here is an access token when we send our refresh token back to that endpoint. And here we're taking the previous state and then we're overriding the access token state. So we have all of the state right here. And remember, when our user logged in, she was also receiving roles. Currently, we're not getting that from the refresh endpoint. So we want to add that as well. I'm going to just break these out onto separate lines so we can see each one. And then I'll add in the user roles too. So what we get here then is roles, and this would be response.data.roles with a comma, and we could save. Now, if you're running the backend code like I am, and you have completed that Node.js for Beginners tutorial where this is all built, I'm going to pull over my instance of the Node.js code here for a moment, and we're looking at the refresh token controller. Now, previously, we were just sending back the access token. So if you have this Node.js code, you're going to want to send back the roles, which were already defined in here. Just send them back in the JSON as well. You could even send back a username, but what I would suggest not doing is do not send back the password that the user has. There's no reason for that. Okay, just wanted to show you that in the Node.js backend code for a second. I'll pull that back off the screen. And so now our useRefreshToken is receiving both the roles and the access token as needed. And without those roles, our user wouldn't be able to access anything because we're using protected routes. And that was in a previous tutorial as well. And we're going to see that next because we're going to go back to our app.js and import our PersistLogin component. So we'll start here. Here's the RequireAuth component. Let's put it right underneath that. So import PersistLogin. There we go. I'm going to hide the file tree again with Control B, but scroll down now. And we just want to wrap this around our protected routes. And we can see that here. We have some public routes that we annotated with a note there or a comment. And we don't need to wrap it around those. We want those to be available either way. But we have this note where we want to protect these routes. And notice each route has a RequireAuth component applied to it. So this is what we want to wrap our PersistLogin around. So we'll start out with a route, and then we'll just set the element attribute equal to PersistLogin, and we'll close out that component, and I need to put another closing one there. Okay, now I'm just going to highlight the closing route, Control X to cut, and scroll down and put this before the catch-all route, so right here. And now I can save, and yes, everything indented as it needs to. So we can see that closing, and now all of these are indented just a little bit, and here's the opening with PersistLogin. And that's all we really need to do here with the routing. Again, in the app.js, when we're using React Router version 6, we don't want logic here. We just want to route and have the components. All the logic should be contained within some of these others. And our layout component as well as our persist component now both make use of that outlet that represents the children, or the child components and routes, if you will. Okay, let's resize this now. Our app should still be running, and we should now have a persistent login applied. So let's check it out. I'm going to expand Chrome, and then I'll do Control-Shift-I. You could also right-click and choose Inspect, at least on Windows. I'll log in Jane. And once she's logged in, we see some things over here in the console. So we started out with isLoading is true, and we had our access token, and then isLoading is false in our access token. And that's really what we wanted. And Jane's here at the admin page. So I'll go home. We could go to the link page, back to the admin page. It hit a 403 because currently I have the access token expiring in like 10 seconds, just so it would check and hit that 403. We got a new access token. Everything's good. Let's go ahead and hit refresh, see what happens. Yep, our page is still here. Jane was able to log back in. Let's see if we got some information up above. Yes, we did. We got isLoading was true at first, and the access token was undefined. And then we have a console log statement in our useRefreshToken hook, it looks like, and our complete auth was just an empty object. But then we had isLoading is false, and we have an access token, and that's why we were able to see this. And it takes us directly to the page that Jane was on, and that's because of some code we put in for React Router in previous tutorials as well. So remember, all those tutorials are linked below if you haven't seen them. We'll go back to home. Now here's a problem though. What if Jane doesn't sign out, and we really haven't hooked up the sign out like we need to? So we're going to do that next. And this is the problem. What if she doesn't sign out and then somebody else comes along and goes to the site? She's logged in until that refresh token expires. She can't really sign out unless we hit that logout endpoint and connect it to our sign out button. So let's do that next. I'll close the DevTools and resize Chrome to get back to Visual Studio Code. Okay, I'm going to quickly drag the Node.js code back over that we're running for the back end, and let's look at the logout controller. Now, it expects to receive a cookie. If it doesn't, it just returns a status 204 with no content because there's really nothing to log out. If there's no cookie there, it has nothing to delete. However, here we're going to get the refresh token from the cookie, so we need to send the cookie back when we hit this logout endpoint. And then down here further in the code, you can see we clear the cookie. This deletes the cookie altogether, and that will keep Jane or any user from being logged back in when they don't expect it. So we need to actually manually apply a way to log out, and that way they won't be logged in until that refresh token expires, which again, the refresh token does need to be set to expire at some point. Okay, let's go back to the file tree, and I'm going to collapse a lot of stuff here. It looks like, but we're in the hooks directory. That's what we want. So I'll highlight the hooks directory, create a new file, and we'll call this useLogout. I'm going to make this a hook because we might want to use this logout in more than one place in the app in the future, but I'm only going to put it in one place today. Okay, we'll import Axios, but instead of just being from Axios, this is from an instance we've already created in our API folder. And this will just be the Axios instance. There we go. And after that, we're going to need the useAuth hook again. So we'll import useAuth from useAuth. We're already in the hooks directory. And now let's define useLogout. And this hook is going to first grab the setAuth from useAuth. Okay, after that, let's define a logout function because this hook is going to return a function and not a value. And this function we'll be able to use then wherever we pull it into our app. So we'll start out by setting our auth back to an empty object. When we log out, we want to empty out the current auth state. After that, we're going to put a try-catch block. And in the try block, we'll start with a response. And we'll set that equal to await Axios. And here we need to hit that logout endpoint. And then we'll have an object, and inside the object we're going to set with credentials to true. So that way we'll send that secure cookie back with this request to this endpoint. Okay, after that we'll put a catch. We'll grab whatever error might happen, and we'll once again go console error and pass in the error. And then at the end of this, we're not quite finished because now we just defined the logout function. We need to go ahead and return logout. And I'll scroll up here because at the very bottom then, we also need to do export default useLogout for our hook. Okay, that's the full hook. So now we need to import this where we're going to use it, and that is back in our home component. Let's go back to the component directory and scroll down to home. So we really haven't looked at this component in a couple of tutorials here. So we were still pulling in our auth directly from the context and not using useAuth at that point. But we don't even need useAuth now. We're going to set the auth inside of useLogout. So I just deleted both of those imports, and here we'll just import useLogout. And after that, we will get rid of this set auth that we're pulling in from the auth context as well. And underneath our useNavigate, I'm going to say const logout and set that equal to useLogout. Now notice we already had a function named logout here, so I'm going to change that existing function to signout with camel case. Get rid of these comments and the set auth because we'll no longer need that. We're already setting the auth to an empty object inside of our logout function coming from useLogout. So here we just need to await the logout and save. Now we need to apply signout where we were calling logout down in the JSX with our buttons. So let's scroll down to the bottom and put sign out there instead of logout. So now we have updated our sign out button, and we're actually going to make a request to that endpoint, the logout endpoint in our backend Node.js REST API. It's going to delete the cookie that has the refresh token, so there will be no refresh token, and we're allowing our users to manually log out. So that helps our security. Okay, with this update complete, let's resize Visual Studio Code, go back to our application. We're going to sign out completely. I'll go ahead and hit the console or Control-Shift-I to open the DevTools console. I'll clear that out as well. Let's go to the login. Okay, and now I'm going to get rid of login in the URL. So we're going to the home page, which is a protected page. Let's see what we get in the console and see what happens. Okay, we were directed back to the login as expected, and this is what happens when we don't have a cookie. And seeing red over here is okay because this is absolutely what was expected. We got a 401 unauthorized because our refresh token didn't exist. We don't have a cookie. So isLoading is true. The access token is undefined. It hits the request or the endpoint for the refresh to get a new token, but we didn't have a cookie to send. And then it fails because of that. And so isLoading is false, but our access token is still undefined, and we're kicked to the login. So that first test works as expected. Now I'll clear out the console again. I'm going to log Jane in. And once she's logged in, we have an access token. Everything looks good. I'll clear out this console again, and let's refresh. Okay. So we start out with no access token, no auth at all. Our state is an empty object. And then we use the refresh token and we get an access token. And this, of course, is the access token that we get back from the useRefreshToken hook. Now our isLoading is false and we have an access token, and it let us go right back to the home page. I'll do that again, and we should get the same results. So we were temporarily loading, and now we're at the home page. If we go to the admin page and we refresh, it should be the same result, but we should now go right back to the admin page, and we do. Okay, I'm going to pull over our Node.js backend one more time. There's one more test we want, and this is going to be when our refresh token expires. So actually our refresh token is issued from the auth controller when a user logs in. Right now I have it set to 1 day. Typically your access token would be 15 minutes or something short, but the refresh token usually lasts longer. However, an access token could be very short. Here we've got 10 seconds. And a refresh token might be as short as 15 minutes or something like that on a financial site. You never know. So we'll set this now to 15 minutes, or 15 seconds, sorry, because we want to see the result when the refresh token is expired. So we have a cookie, but the token inside the cookie is expired. So now let's try that out. I'll pull this back off the screen, and we'll come back over here, and we're going to need to log out, totally signed out. Clear everything out there. And now we're going to need to log in and get a token. So here's the login. There we go. So here we go with Jane, and She's logged in now, and she gets a refresh token, but that refresh token is going to expire very quickly. So I'll clear this out, and maybe we'll still see everything. Nope, there we go. So we're logged in right now. We got a 403. So it had been 10 seconds. The access token had expired, and we got a new one because the refresh token was still valid. But at this point now, it's been 15 seconds. The refresh token will have expired. So now if I refresh our page, we should get booted back out because our refresh token has expired. And that's what happens. Notice we don't get a 401 like we did when we didn't have a cookie at all. We do have a cookie, it's just that our refresh token was expired. So we got a 403 here. Otherwise, the user sees the same result. No refresh token is valid, so they're kicked back out here to the login. And that's great. So everything's working. When Jane's logged in and has a valid refresh token, it works. And if Jane is logged in and has an expired refresh token, it doesn't work. I'm going to pull the Node.js code back over here quickly, and I'm going to change that 15 seconds back to 1 day for now and save, because we're finished checking with that. After that, so we're back to where our refresh token won't expire quickly. After that, we have another security issue to talk about. So we have it now where Jane can log out, but what if she forgets to? Or what if any employee forgets to? And say they're on vacation, they're in a hotel lobby, they log in, they forget to log out, and now that refresh token's good for an entire day in our situation, and so anybody else that goes to the site will be logged in as Jane or whichever employee used that hotel computer, the one in the lobby that's available to everybody. That's not good. So we need to put a trust this device check here, and that will allow Jane or any employee to go ahead and say trust this device or not. So if they're on a public computer, then they can just say, no, we don't want to trust this device, and that will disable the persistent login altogether. But if they're on their home computer or office computer, they could check trust this device, and then they'll be able to stay logged in as long as they have a refresh token that hasn't expired. So let's go ahead and once again close the DevTools, resize Chrome, come back to Visual Studio Code, and expand it. From here, I'm going to collapse the components directory and go to the context directory. We have an AuthProvider context here, so click on that, and currently we're just sending the auth and set auth in the AuthProvider. But now we need to add some more state. So now let's go ahead and say const, and we're going to have not an object, but another array. There we go, persist and set persist. And I'm going to set that equal to use state, but I'm going to want to expand this. So Control B to hide the file tree again. And now I'm going to say json.parse. And inside of this, I'm going to have local storage. Now earlier today for this tutorial, I said we wouldn't use local storage for access tokens or refresh tokens, and we're not. This is only going to hold a Boolean to say whether we trust this device or not. And that's just fine for local storage. So here we'll put get item, and let's call this persist, if I could spell persist. But if that doesn't exist, we need to put a fallback here. So we want to start with false if that doesn't exist. So I'm going to press Alt-Z so this wraps, because even with the full screen, it was wrapping off of the screen. So now we have our full line, local storage.getItem, and we're getting the persist value if it exists, and if not, we're just going to go with the default of false. Now, inside of our provider, we also need to pass in persist and set persist, so those will be available as well, and we'll be able to pull those directly from useAuth, just like we are auth and setAuth, because it has the auth context in it. With that complete, let's go back to the file tree, and inside of the file tree, I'm going to open up the components directory and go back to the PersistLogin component we've created today. So now we're pulling in auth from useAuth, so we also need to grab persist here. And with persist, we're going to apply some logic in our JSX. So this was already applying a little bit of logic based on is loading. But now persist is essentially going to say whether we need to do this check at all. So if we don't need to do this check, we just want to show the outlet. So let's say if we do not have persist, and I'll create an extra line here because this will be a chain ternary, but it's not a big complicated one, so I hope you don't mind. I like chain ternaries. We've got an outlet. This just represents all of the child components and routes. And just like we are here, but we're saying if persist is false, just go straight to those components. Otherwise, then we'll have a chain ternary here that checks the isLoading. This is what we were already checking. If isLoading is true, show loading, otherwise show the outlet. So when this is all finished, we just added this additional check here for persist. And if it's false, we're just going to skip this check altogether and go straight to the outlet. So let's save. Okay, and with this complete, we now need to add our checkbox to the login. So let's go over to the login component. And at the top of the login component, we're already bringing in setAuth from useAuth, but now we're going to need persist and setPersist here as well. Let's go ahead and hide the file tree and scroll down to our JSX. We want to find our button in the JSX, and we're going to put our checkbox right underneath that button. There we are. Okay, we're going to start with a div. And then this div is going to have a class name, and we'll set this equal to, at least if you're going to use the CSS that I have, to persist check. Now, mentioning CSS, this is not a CSS tutorial, but I am going to include a little extra CSS in the index.css file in this repository, so it will format this correctly. And you can check that out in the code if you want to. If not, you can format this in your own way. Now we need an input. And this input type is not going to be text. It is going to be a checkbox. So now I'll hit return. I want to keep each attribute on a separate line here for our input. And I'll scroll up so we have some more room to add these other attributes. So after the type being checkbox, we'll set an ID. Let's set this ID equal to persist. After that, we'll have an onChange event. And I'm going to set that equal to a function we're going to create called toggle persist. After that, we'll set our checked value equal to the persist state. And now we're finished with the input, but every input needs a label. So let's create a label. And this label has an HTML4 attribute that needs to match the ID of the input. So it is persist as well. And then for the label, I'm just going to put trust this device and save. Now before I forget, I'm going to quickly go to the file tree, scroll down over here, select my index.css, scroll to the bottom just to throw this CSS in for this checkbox. And again, you can reference this in the repository if you want to use my CSS, and save. So it's going to look like we want it to. Okay, after that, we need to scroll back up and put our logic up above the JSX in our login.js. Okay, so we're above the return for the JSX, and now I'm going to define toggle persist as an arrow function. And inside toggle persist, we're just going to set persist, and I'm going to use the previous state here, and then it will just be the opposite of whatever it was. So we can save that, but we also need a useEffect. So let me scroll up just a little bit for some more room. And now we'll put a useEffect here. And this is going to listen for whenever the persist state changes. So we need to put that in our dependency array. And if the persist state changes, that's when we want to go ahead and store that value in local storage. So this will be local storage dot set item, and we're setting the persist value, and then we're just going to set it to the persist state and save. Okay, with that complete, let's resize Visual Studio Code, and we'll resize Chrome, and we'll also inspect or Control Shift and the letter I just to see everything in the console. Got an empty console here, but we do have a trust this device check, and we should be able to toggle it. As a matter of fact, let's go to the Application tab, and if we expand this even just a little bit more, we can see the persist value is true, and if we uncheck our checkbox, now the persist value is false. So that's as expected also. Let's go ahead and go back to our console, resize this just a little more, and now I wonder how that got smaller. Let's go this back to around 860 or so. Let's log Jane in. And once she's logged in, we said trust this device, so we should be able to refresh, and Jane should get taken right back here to the home page. Yep, everything's fine. We go to the admin page, we could refresh again, and Jane is still on the admin page. So our persistent login is working. Let's go back to home and sign out. We'll go back to the login once again, and we will not trust the device when Jane logs in. And once we log in, we're at the home page. Let's refresh, and we should get kicked back out, and we do. Oh, we've got a message over here. Let's see what we've got. It talks about performing a React state update on an unmounted component. Yes, this is an issue, something that I skipped over. Let's go back and fix this in our code. I'm going to close the console. Everything's working as it should, except we just have a little memory leak there. That error is coming from the PersistLogin component, and we just need to put an isMounted variable in here. So let's define isMounted with the let keyword, and we'll set that to true at the top of the useEffect. And now we need to check that before we set our isLoading state, and that is because we're getting that memory leak from trying to set the state to an unmounted component, and we keep this state inside of this component. So what we'll do here in the finally is just say isMounted 2 ampersands. That's saying if isMounted is true, then go ahead and set the isLoading. And we can find out if the component is mounted or not by using the cleanup function in useEffect. And now inside of this anonymous function that will run whenever the component is unmounted, we'll just set isMounted equal to false. Now let's resize Visual Studio Code again. We'll come back and do the same thing here just to make sure we don't have that memory leak any longer. Okay, we'll clean out the console, and now we'll log Jane in once again, and we will not use the trust this device. Now she's on the home page. Let's go ahead and reload, and we should get kicked back out. Yes, and now no warning message. We don't have a memory leak because we fixed that inside of that component. Okay, I hope this tutorial has shown you how to add a persistent login without using local storage for the access tokens, but still use it in your application when you want to trust this device. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.